The peak. Before we understand the fall, we must understand the height. For 2 centuries, Rome was not just a city or an empire, it was the entire world. This was the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that felt like it would last forever. If you stood in the Forum during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the concept of an end would seem like madness. Rome had paved the earth. It had systematized law, architecture, and war. A citizen could walk from the rainy coasts of Britannia to the sands of Syria using the same currency, speaking the same language, protected by the same legions. It was the triumph of order over chaos. The empire was a machine that turned barbarism into civilization, or so they believed. But perfection is static, and the world is dynamic. The seeds of the fall were not planted by enemies at the gates, but by the very success of the system itself. The borders stopped expanding. The influx of gold and slaves slowed down. The machine began to idle, and in that stillness, the first hairline fractures began to appear in the marble. It is easy to govern when you are growing. It is much harder to govern when you are simply holding on. The golden age is dangerous because it convinces you that the sun will never set. But the sun always sets. The crack. Stability is fragile. In the 3rd century, the illusion broke. It didn't happen slowly, it happened all at once. In a span of just 50 years, Rome saw 26 different emperors. Most were murdered. The throne became a death sentence, yet men killed to sit on it. This was the crisis of the 3rd century. The political legitimacy of the empire evaporated. When the leadership rots, the body follows. To pay for the constant civil wars and the loyalty of the armies, Rome debased its currency. They mixed silver with cheap copper. Money became worthless. Inflation skyrocketed. People stopped trusting the coin, so they stopped trusting the state. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries collapsed into local bartering. The unified world fractured into isolated pockets of survival. A plague swept through the population, decimating the workforce and the legions. It felt like the apocalypse. The empire actually split into 3 separate pieces, held together only by the desperate force of will. This was the moment Rome should have died. It survived, but it was no longer the same beast. It was scarred, paranoid, and fundamentally changed. The trust was gone. And an empire without trust is just an army occupying its own land. The division. When a body is too large for one heart, it fails. Emperor Diocletian understood this. He looked at the map and realized the impossible scale of Rome. It was too big to govern, too vast to defend. So, he drew a line down the center. He divided the empire into east and west. It was a logical decision that became a fatal one. The east, governed from what would become Constantinople, was rich. It had the old trade routes of Asia, the grain of Egypt, the population density of the Greeks. The west was rural, exposed, and poor. By splitting the administration, they theoretically doubled the efficiency. In reality, they cut the lifeline. The west needed the east's money to survive. The east, however, no longer needed the west's problems. Over time, they drifted apart. They became 2 siblings who shared a name but no longer shared a destiny. Latin faced Greek. Rome faced Constantinople. When threats arrived, the east could bribe them to go away specifically, to go west. The division created a survivor and a sacrifice. The west was left to drift, underfunded and overstretched, while the east walled itself up in gold. Rome was no longer the center of the world. It was just a city in the poorer half of a dying marriage. The rot. Empires rarely die from murder. They die from sickness. The sickness of the Western Empire was economic paralysis. As the state became desperate for funds to pay the military, taxes rose to suffocating levels. But the heavy hand of the state did not fall equally. The ultra-rich, the senatorial class, used their influence to avoid paying. They retreated to massive, self-sufficient estates in the countryside, effectively opting out of the empire. The burden fell entirely on the middle class and the poor. The middle class was crushed out of existence. Small farmers, unable to pay taxes or compete with slave labor estates, sold themselves into serfdom for protection. The social contract was broken. Why fight for an empire that takes everything and gives nothing? Innovation stalled. Infrastructure decayed because there was no money to fix the roads. The economy became static, frozen in a caste system where if your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. Hope evaporated. When the people have no stake in the system, they will not lift a finger to save it when the fire starts. The rot was deep. Rome was hollowed out from the inside long before the first barbarian kicked down the door. The outsourcing. Who defends the walls? Ideally, citizens, people who fight for their homes. But Romans had stopped fighting. The endless wars, the plagues, and the economic despair had drained the manpower. To fill the ranks, Rome turned to the very people they called barbarians. They hired Germanic tribesmen as mercenaries. At first, it seemed brilliant. It was cheaper and faster. But slowly, the composition of the legions changed. The army became Roman in name only. These soldiers spoke Germanic dialects. They worshipped Germanic gods. Their loyalty was not to the abstract idea of Rome or the emperor, but to their specific commanders and to the gold they were promised. If the gold stopped, the loyalty stopped. This is dangerous. The state had outsourced its monopoly on violence to people who had no cultural attachment to the state. High-ranking generals were no longer Roman aristocrats. They were tribal warlords with Roman titles. They became the power behind the throne. They made and unmade emperors. The defenders of Rome became its captors. The wolves were not just at the door. They were wearing the uniforms of the sheepdogs. The wave. History is physics. For every action, there is a reaction. Far to the east, on the steppes of Asia, a terrifying force began to move. The Huns. They were a cavalry force of nature, pushing westward with irresistible violence. They did not initially attack Rome. They attacked the tribes outside Rome. The Goths, the Vandals, the Alans. These tribes were not invading Rome out of malice. They were fleeing for their lives. They arrived at the Roman border not as conquerors, but as refugees. Rome, in its arrogance and corruption, failed to handle this crisis. When the Goths asked for sanctuary, Roman officials exploited them, starved them, and abused them. Desperation turns refugees into warriors. The Goths rebelled inside the borders. At the Battle of Adrianople, they didn't just defeat a Roman army. They annihilated it and killed the Eastern Emperor. The myth of Roman invincibility was shattered. The borders were no longer lines in the sand. They were porous membranes. Entire nations migrated into the empire, bringing their families, their carts, and their swords. Rome could not assimilate them, so it was swallowed by them. The map became a blur of movement. The stagnant empire was being washed away by a tidal wave of humanity. The shock, August 24th, 410 AD, a date that shook the psychological foundation of the ancient world. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, stood at the gates of Rome. They didn't need to batter them down. They starved the city until someone inside opened the gates for them. For the first time in 800 years, Rome was occupied by a foreign enemy. The looting lasted 3 days. Physically, the damage was limited. They burned some buildings, stole gold, and left. But spiritually, the damage was total. Rome was the eternal city. It was divinely protected. If Rome could burn, then nothing was safe. The psychological anchor of the West was severed. St. Augustine wrote The City of God in response, arguing that we should place our hope in heaven because earthly empires, even Christian ones, are dust. It was an admission of defeat. The emperor at the time, Honorius, was reportedly safe in his palace in Ravenna, feeding his pet chickens, indifferent to the collapse. The brain had detached from the body. The citizens realized they were alone. The spell was broken. Rome was just a city of brick and bone, and it was burning like any other. The end. The end of the Roman Empire was not a cinematic explosion. It was a bureaucratic memo. By 476 AD, the Western Empire was a ghost. The emperor was a child named Romulus Augustulus, a cruel irony, bearing the name of Rome's founder and its first emperor. He was a puppet with no strings attached. The real power lay with Odoacer, a Germanic general. Odoacer decided the charade had gone on long enough. He didn't execute the boy. He just sent him away to a villa with a pension. Odoacer didn't even bother to declare himself Emperor of the West. He realized the title was meaningless. He packed up the imperial insignia, the crown, the robes, the scepter, and mailed them to Constantinople. His message was simple. We don't need an emperor in the West anymore. He declared himself King of Italy, and that was it. No great battle, no final speech. The lights just went out. The complex political structure that had ruled for a millennium was simply archived. The people in the fields kept farming. The sun came up the next day. But the Roman Empire, as a political entity in the West, had ceased to exist. It died with a whimper, suffocated by the weight of its own history. The legacy. But did it fall? Or did it transform? Matter is neither created nor destroyed. The Roman Empire vanished from the maps, but it dissolved into the groundwater of history. The chaotic tribes that conquered the West put on Roman robes. They adopted Roman laws. They spoke dialects of Latin that became Italian, French, Spanish. The political structure collapsed. But the spiritual structure, the Catholic Church, stepped into the vacuum. The Pope became the new emperor. Rome remained the capital of the faith. The structure of the diocese, the architecture of the basilica, the very calendar we use today, it is all Roman. We are still living in the shadow of that empire. The fall was necessary. It cleared away a system that had become paralyzed, allowing new nations and new ideas to grow in the soil of the old world. Rome taught us that nothing lasts. Not power, not borders, not gold. But ideas endure. The empire died, but the civilization survived. It reminds us that collapse is not always an end. Sometimes it is a painful, messy, necessary metamorphosis. Rome fell so that Europe could be born. We often confuse the end of a system with the end of the world. But history is a river, not a stone. If you want to understand where that river flows next and explore the ideas that shape our reality, subscribe. I'll be here.